Well, thank you for joining us at the Art Deco Society UK, all to talk about Clarice Cliff. But before we do that, tell me a bit more about yourself and your wonderful day job.
Well, I suppose I'm a career auctioneer, antique enthusiast. I first got interested in antiques at the very, very early age. My late mum and my gran were wonderful fans of antiques and hunting and so on and so forth. And we spent most of my childhood going all over the country in the pursuit of the next find. So I actually spent a lot of time at my grandmother's knee, which was absolutely fantastic. She was a wonderful woman. And my parents were both running their own businesses. And I remember once at my grandmother's, when I was about 11 years old, I was rummaging through her home and through her house. And on the landing, she had a 1930s Art Deco sideboard. And I went ferreting in this while she was in the kitchen baking, which is what she always did. And at the back of the cupboard, I found a Shelley coffee set, an Art Deco Shelley coffee set. And having spent many years going around the antique fairs, I recognized it, I knew the name. So I went running downstairs to my grandma with a cup and saucer, going, Grandma, Grandma, you've got a Shelley coffee set. And she said, I know. And I said, but it's Art Deco. And she went, I know. And I said, can I have it? And she went, no. You're 11 years old, you can't have it. And funnily enough, a few months later, for my Christmas present, she'd wrapped it up in a box for me. And that started my love affair with ceramics. I'd collected other things before then, but that really sparked my love of ceramics. So then suddenly at the age of 11, 12 years old, going around the antique fairs, I had a purpose, and my purpose was finding Shelley at first. But everywhere I stopped at people who were selling Shelley, I started to see Clarice. And no disrespect, because I have no doubts that some of your members will be avid Shelley collectors and fans. But for an 11, 12-year-old boy, there was just a little bit more pizzazz. And I thought I've got to start collecting this. So I'll come back to that story in a while. But then my general career in life, I went to university. I studied silversmithing and jewellery. I did that with a combined fine art history degree. But all the way through university, I basically dealt in antiques to fund my career and fund my life.
Wow.
And at the end of it all, I realised that I didn't want to be a jeweler or a silversmith. In fact, I was a lousy silversmith. I wasn't a very good jeweler either. But the one thing that I did really want to do was antiques. I was a dealer for a very short space of time. That was a disaster. As my father pointed out, I had the best collection and the worst stock. And it was deemed that the career that I should go into was auctioneering, because the one thing about being an auctioneer is, as my father said, you don't literally have to spend your own money, you just have to have your knowledge.
Yeah.
And he always thought I got that knowledge. And fast forward, I mean, I've been an auctioneer now over 25 years.
Wow.
And it's the most glorious career I could have ever wished for. And of course, wrapped into that, I've been incredibly fortunate on a sort of, a level with television, in the fact that at an age and at a time, my face fitted, and I'm under no illusions. I don't see any form of celebrity. I don't see it like that. I'm just very, very lucky that I've been given a platform where I can share my knowledge and my enthusiasm. Because, I mean, we're coming up to nearly 40 years involvement with Clarice Cliff. So that alone really is probably my cornerstone. So and it radiates from there. I always remember my grandmother telling me that the more you learn, the less you know. And my dad topped in with that and said, you can always know a lot about a little, or a little about a lot. And Clarice is my a lot about a little, I suppose, because I'm very much a fan of the matriarch. I was brought up in a matriarchal household. Women have always steered my path, and I'm very comfortable with that. And whether it was my mum, my grandma, Beverly, who was some of the some of your members will no doubt know the name Beverly, one of the greatest Art Deco dealers of our time, who's sadly now gone, but taught me a lot. And Clarice, I would say those four women have pretty much formed my life and my career.
Wow.
So I am forever grateful to them for that. You know, all of your members, all your Art Deco fans, they all have this passion. And I've always said Art Deco really is, it's the one period and era that I love more than anything. And it's one of those eras that really, I think, probably no era before that, probably the last era that it is comparable to is the Georgian era. You
Yeah.
look at the Georgian era, and that had an impact on everything, whether it was a door handle, architecture, clothing. And I think as much as Victorian becomes slightly homogenized, but when Art Deco lands, everybody has their own interpretation of it. I've always said Art Deco is incredibly nationalistic. Everyone has their own interpretation of the style, but it was a style that had its impact on everything from the packaging that you picked up to the dress that you wore to the door handle that you opened to the environment that you lived in. And this is why Clarice for me is so pivotal, because she realized that she had a part to play in a time that was groundbreaking,
Yeah.
all stemming out of that 1925 exhibition. And, you know, Clarice is very British. It's a very, you know, she's a very British designer, but her influence became global.
Yeah, well, that's the interesting thing, isn't it? So really, you know, the title of your piece, Clarice Cliff, A Bizarre Life, was her bizarre wear the collection that changed her life? Was that because that was 28? Was that
1927 she
27?
launched.
Right.
So
Okay.
Clarice had the most amazing life. One of the things I adore about Clarice, and whenever I lecture on it, I always drop this little bit of information in, because Clarice was actually born in 1899, and she hated that. She hated it because it made her a woman of the 19th century. So she used to lie, and she used to say that she was born in 1900 because that made her a 20th century woman. And she was a woman who, even from a very early age, was incredibly defiant. I mean, for those who don't know much of her background, she was born in Mere Street in Tunstall in a two up, two down. Her mother took in washing. Her father was an iron foundry worker. Very modest beginnings. But as was the case at that time, of course, children were expected to go out and work. And like all of her siblings, she went out to work very young, had a number of positions. And the one thing about Clarice that must have infuriated her mother, Annie, must have driven Annie to distraction. Clarice got a job as a paintress. She was a very skilled artist, but within a few months, she swapped factories and became a gilder. Then she went to Wilkinson's, which was to be her defining career point, just at the age of 16 years old, and became a lithographer. Well, in the industry, being a lithographer was a very lower class level of job than being a paintress.
Hmm.
But Clarice knew what she was doing, and all of these elements, it was her knowing her mind. And Clarice actually, what she wanted to do was really learn the whole of the industry, whether it was making the pots, turning them on the lathe, fettling them, glazing them, firing them, painting them, gilding them, modeling them. So for someone so young to know all of this and have this as her course and aim is remarkable. I think it's absolutely remarkable. Now, you mentioned 27. Well, 27 and the launch of Bizarreware really was the turning point.
Mm.
Slightly earlier in her career, when she was 22, she had been spotted. She'd been pulled off the factory floor into the design studio, working alongside Butler and Ridgway. Now, John Butler and Fred Ridgway were two powerhouses in the potteries. Bearing in mind, A.J. Wilkinson's at this point was considered the largest pot bank in the potteries. Phenomenal place. And there she was, a young woman being put into the design studio. But what we have to look at, this is a young woman fighting in an era where women didn't do this. women didn't have a voice. And this is what I love about her. And I will also give credit to her peers, Charlotte Reed, Susie Cooper, Violet Elmer at Carlton Wear. These were all very strong women who knew that they were going to make a change in a time where they weren't really being regarded as anything other than women who painted pots. But this 27 date marks the launch of Bizarre. It marks Clarice really entering into the marketplace. And it was born out of the 1926 general strike.
Right.
Now, the problem was with the general strike, there was no coal. When you've got no coal, you can't fire pots. So the potteries industry was pretty much brought to its knees because without the raw materials, what can you do?
Mm.
But Clarice, being so shrewd, and this is the thing that we've got to come back to again and again with Clarice, is not only was she smart and driven, she was an incredible businesswoman. And she went to Collie Shorter, who was her boss at Wilkinson's, and said, right, Collie, next door at Newport, that old factory you've just bought, the warehouse is full of substandard whiteware. Now, for those who don't know, whiteware is pottery that has been fired and glazed, ready for decorating. But this whiteware was considered substandard. It got flaws and grit in it. Collie said, we can't use that. She went, give me one painteress and 3 months, and I'll show you what we're going to do. And with that, she created and launched Bizarre. And the idea was that it was bold, vibrant, colourful. You've got to put it as well into context of a time where, and this is a time when it was about class and it was about gender, where women in the homes had had years of very twee, very dainty pots that were, covered in little sprigs of flowers. And here comes Clarice with one painteress and over 3 months created a range of wares that were bold with big, big diamonds and triangles of colour where you could see the brushstrokes. And when Collie questioned that, he said, but I can see the brushstrokes. She said, I know. I want the buyer to know it's been hand painted. Now, we take all these things for credit today because we know what hand painted wares look like.
Mm.
She said, I want them to know that somebody has lovingly decorated this. I want it to be bright. I want it to be bold. Collie believed in her. He actually sent the first batch of wares out with his leading salesman, a chap called Ewart Oakes. Now, Ewart was incredibly doubtful it would sell. He thought it was gaudy. He thought it was brash. He thought it was juvenile. But he took it to Oxford to a department store where the lead buyer was a woman. He told her that this had been designed by a new lady designer, painted by women, and this is one of Clarice's early taglines, wares painted for women by women.
Wow.
And the buyer in Oxford bought the whole carload in one go.
That's amazing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this then spawned Collie. Ewart went back to Collie and went, she's bought the lot and wants another 100 pieces by next week. It's like, and it snowballed from there, snowballed.
Yeah, completely. What's that about the butterfly? That her butterfly work to cover up small flaws?
Correct. Absolutely. Now, if you watch the new film that's been released about it, which we may get to, there are two stories. There are two themes of how did Clarice get discovered. The one story is that in her spare time, now most of the girls on lunch break would go off and have their sandwiches or walk out or whatever. Clarice never took her breaks. She would stay in the studio on her own. Now, bear in mind, she was a lithographer. So at Wilkinson, she wasn't allowed to paint, but it is said that the factory manager walked through on one lunch break to find Clarice sat on her own, painting a butterfly on a plate, freehand. She thought she was in trouble because he took her and the plate up to Collie, and this is when she was about 22 years old, showed Collie, and he said, did you do this? And she said, yes. And that was the pivotal point where she was transferred to the design workshop with Butler and Ridgway. Now, at the time, they were creating a range called Oriflamme. And the Oriflamme range was very much, very opulent, very Edwardian. lots of gold, lots of beautiful iridescent running glazes. But they did Tibetan, Oriflamme, and it was often overpainted with little gilded butterflies. And that was one of her first jobs. And again, it was the idea of covering over an imperfection with some decoration. Now, this isn't new. This is something that was happening in the 18th century at Meissen. They would cover up a floor in ceramic with a little butterfly or an insect or a flower to make the wear best rather than second. So Clarice was just utilizing a centuries old tradition, but it was the sort of a stepping stone to the career that then pushed her forward into the world of bizarre.
I love it though. I mean, it's just so magical, isn't it? Creating something beautiful from a floor is that's what it should be.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And this is where Clarice, again, was a very, very clever businesswoman
yeah,
and would always have one eye on the books, always one eye on the books.
right. Before we move away to that from that film, because I've not seen it, The Colour Room.
Right.
What, you were actually had a role to play as consultant, didn't you? But you were also
Yeah.
in the film, I understand.
Well, yeah, it was one of these moments where everything, where stars align. Um, I got a phone call from somebody saying, "Have you read The Guardian today?" And I said, "No, why?" And they said, "Well, they're releasing a film on Clarice Cliff. Are you involved?" And I said, "No, I'm not." Shock horror, But anyway, I said, "Well, I watch with bated breath." That afternoon, we had a bit of involvement with a colleague at work who actually emailed the production company and said, "Look, if you need any advice, Will's here, he's happy to help." And bizarrely, then I got a phone call about 2 hours later thinking, "Oh, well, they've read my email." And this chap said, "I'm phoning from the production company. We're making a film on Clarice Cliff and we need to speak to you." I said, "Oh, have you got my email?" And he said, "What email?" And he said, "No, we've just researched you. We just need to speak to you. We understand that you know a bit about Clarice." So I start having this chat with them and talking to them. And there was one line which I think tipped the scales in my favor, which was, he said, "Well, we found the location. We're going to film it in Leek. We can't get a location in Stoke. We're going to film it in Leek. It's the most beautiful canal side warehouse. The sunlight floods in. It's beautiful." I said, "Well, that's not right. It's no good." And he said to me, "Why?" I said, "Well, there's a problem there." I said, "You can't film it with the sunlight streaming through the windows." I said, "The girls never liked that and they never worked like that." I said, "In fact, what the girls used to do," and when I say girls, I don't mean that detrimentally, they were called the Bizarre Girls.
Yeah, yeah,
At one point, they were going to be called the Bizarre Babes,
right.
but Clarice put her foot down and thought that was a bit much. So they became known as the Bizarre Girls.
And some say
And
Claire as well. What's all that about?
some say what, sorry?
Some say Bizarre. What's that about?
Yeah, no, it's bizarre. It
Yeah,
is bizarre, as in the word bizarre.
it sounds
Yeah,
better. Yeah.
definitely bizarre. Anyway, so I said to him, I said, "Well, what the girls used to do was sellotape the Stoke Sentinel and tracing paper over the windows to block the sun out and diffuse the light so that they could paint, because otherwise the sun was in their eyes and they couldn't paint." And he said, "Well, how do you know that?" And I said, "Well, they told me." And he said, "Who told you?" I said, "The Bizarre Girls." He said, "But they're all dead." I said, "Sadly, they are now, but they were very much alive when I met them." And back in the late 80s, really, I met all the surviving Bizarre Girls.
No
And
way.
yeah, yeah, and sat and talked with them. I have to say, my favourite's Elsie Nixon. Elsie Nixon was the grandmother that everybody wants. The very jolly, robust, rotund, huggable kind of lady.
Yeah.
Elsie would sit and talk to you about Clarice for hours. Then you got Marjorie Higginson, Marjorie was a force to be reckoned with. You would not cross Marjorie. Marjorie knew the facts and knew the stories. And then people like Renée Dale. I mean, Renée was just a pocket rocket of a woman, absolute pocket rocket. And they would tell you stories. And because I was very young, they were almost sort of a bit bemused why a young boy would be so interested in pottery that at that point was 60 years old, 70 years old. So I learned all these stories and I was feeding them all this information. And they both went silent. I had the artistic director there and the head of production. And he said, "You really know your stuff, don't you?" And I said, "Well, I love it. I'm not being glib. I love it." Anyway, they then turned around to me and said, "Would you be involved all the way along? Can you be our voice? Can you be our historical advisor?" And I said, "Absolutely, I'd love that." And they said, "We've got no money. We're on a really tight budget. We don't know how we could pay you." And me being me, this engages often before that. I said, "Oh, that's very easy. Just let me be in the film." And he turned around, clicked like that, and he said, "Not a problem. We can do that. No problem." And I genuinely thought I was going to get an Eric Morecambe brown coat broom at the back of shop scene, and turned up on site on the first day of filming. The director walked on set, who I'd not met, a lady called Claire McCarthy. She walked straight over to me. She went, "You're Will Farmer." I said, "I am." She said, "I've got your books. I've read all about you. I'm so honoured to have you." This is the director. I'm getting a bit starstruck because she's done serious work.
Yeah.
And she said, "Are you here today to be an extra?" And I said, "Yeah." She went, "No, I'm not having that. We're going to give you a speaking part."
Oh.
And it just went from there. And it was the most unbelievable 2 months. Well, that year, 2021, was a bit of a Clarice roller coaster for me. Rounded off with being invited to the premiere and doing the red carpet and all of that, which I will never get to do again. So yet again, a cornerstone of my life. Thank you, Clarice.
Now, just going back to when we were talking about the bazaarware, have you got any bazaarware to show us?
Well, I have. I've bought all sorts with me, and I thought I'd have to start really by showing you and sharing with you the first piece I ever bought. And if I could just show you to the camera. So this is a classic conical teacup and saucer. And it's got, if I show you the back stamp at the back, if we get it the right way around, we've got that classic Bazaar by Clarice Cliff, that mark there. And it's got that classic solid handle, which Clarice became famous for. And I bought this and the accompanying saucer when I was 11 years old for the princely sum of £15.
Oh.
And over my life, I have had 5. I'm on collection number 5 at the moment. Because every time, Clarice has helped me move house many times. Every time I've bought a new house and upgraded and pushed myself, I've always ended up selling my collections and buying again, but I would never, ever let that go. That's where it all started.
No, I don't blame you. I don't blame
I mean,
you.
it's probably worth today. It's probably only worth today £15. Maybe a bit more. I'm probably being cruel because it's the cup's got a chip, the saucer's got a hairline, the side plate's got a hairline. But I didn't care. At 15 years old, that was the starting point for me. And of course, now as a collector, I had to bring that with me.
Yes, look at that.
Because anybody who's worth anything in the world of Clarice, you've got to have a piece of crocus.
Crocus, yeah. I've got a little sugar.
Exactly. And this is the thing. You've got to bear in mind, again, and this is a very early one, because we've got the big bizarre mark, the hand-painted crocus. And that is, that's classic Clarice.
Yeah.
And what a lot of people don't realize is this pattern ran from 1928 to 1964.
Really?
Absolutely. She was still painting this in 1964 when she sold the factory to Midwinter.
No, I never realised.
But everybody who I know who owns a collection of Clarice, you've got to have a piece of crocus in there.
Shall I grab a towel so we can match them up?
Absolutely. Oh yeah, let's do it.
There you go.
Oh, lovely. So if you hold up right, so turn it over. Let me see the base of yours.
Is it upside down?
Oh, yours is right. So that is with the print. Right, mine's got the green crocus mark.
Oh yeah.
Now, again, a little display of Clarice the businesswoman.
Right.
The early wares, every piece had a hand-painted green crocus mark. Now, Clarice realised very quickly that every second that took to paint, the girls weren't painting the pots. So then she changed it and had the word crocus printed. Why? Because it was quicker. Saving paint, saving time. She also said, I mean, if you look at this, how big, this is very early, how big the crocuses are on mine.
Yeah.
She realised that the girls didn't need to, and in the middle here, so you've got two colours. Let me
Yeah.
pull that into, sorry. You've got two colours there, the yellow and the orange.
Hmm.
No point, didn't need to do it. Stop doing it. Save time, save paint. Yours dates from about 1930 to 1931 and
Right.
is called Holborn Fruit Bowl. But it just shows you the pattern and how fabulous it was. I mean, I always remember
Yeah.
I interviewed Renee Dale for the BBC, and she was one of the Crocus girls. And Ethel Barrow was the main Crocus girl. And if anybody out there wants to have a little tip, Clarice never allowed her girls to put their own name on the wares. Ethel Barrow was her main number one girl. She was the girl who went with her to start the original range, and then she was the lady who ran the crocus shop. Now, the crocus shop, the ladies in there were painting crocus 6.5 days a week, right the way through the year. And Ethel was a bit cheeky because she realised that she could put a little tip that meant people would know it was hers. And what she would do is, in the middle of the design, the green grasses that come up through the crocus,
Yeah.
you would break one. So if anybody at home has got a piece of crocus with a broken piece of grass, it's by Ethel Barrow.
I love that. That's adorable.
It is wonderful. It is wonderful. And of course, you've got to bear in mind, I mean, crocus sold all over the world. I mean, Clarice did 2 shipments a year to the colonies. So Canada, North America, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. And at the peak of her business, she was producing, the Bazaar girls were producing 19,000 pieces a week.
Incredible.
A week.
90,000.
19,000 pieces a week. Over her career, she is credited with making 8 million pieces of pottery.
That's incredible.
It's phenomenal.
Yeah.
And this is part of the reason why today she is so important, because you can have something that people want to collect, but if there's not enough supply to keep the market happy, the market dies.
Mm.
Well, the thing with Clarice is it's abundant, it's out there, you can find it, and beautiful pieces come to market all the time. And the other thing about Clarice is it's not elitist. Because Clarice had such a breadth of her designs, you can go in, you could buy, any of your members could go out and buy a piece of crocus with less than £100 in their pocket. But if you want to buy something really rare, sky's the limit.
Yeah. Show me something else.
Okay, well, if we go from one end of the spectrum to the other,
Okay.
Clarice's career for everybody is, of course, so everyone counts 1927 as the start. Her career runs to 1964 when Collie Shorter, who was originally her boss, then becomes her husband. It was a very poorly kept secret that they were having an affair. He married her not that long after his wife died, but they'd been having an affair for a long time. So much so that everybody in Stoke-on-Trent knew. A little bit of a telltale sign is when a woman like Clarice leaves home and lives on her own, not done in the 1930s. Women didn't go and live on their own unless they were of questionable repute. She was the first woman in the potteries to own her own car. She moved into her own flat. And a bit of a giveaway was often Collie Shorter's Rolls Royce was seen parked outside her flat in Snow Hill. So everyone knew. But the key years really are for everybody, 1927 to 1936. Those are the glory years. Those are when Clarice is at her absolute pinnacle. And then within those years, we look really to 1929 to 1932. Why? Because when the potteries were trying to be new, Clarice was beating them hands down
Oh, look at that.
with things
Ah,
like this. So
so
you've
what's
got to know.
mm,
So this is a flower vase
mm,
called a Shape 515. And typical Clarice with this beautiful finned handles.
yeah.
But look at the design. Look at
Look at
this.
look at it.
It's in a pattern called Cafe. And it's believed that it was sort of inspired by a Swiss-born artist called Sophie Tabauer Arp. Now, why do we call it Cafe? Because in 1927-28, Sophie Tabauer Arp was part of the big art movements going on around Europe. She was part of the Dadaist movement and the Surrealists, and she created the interior design for a cafe called the Café Aubert. And when we look at the design for the Café Aubert, the tiled floor and the wall murals, they are basically very close to this. So we know that Clarice was taking very expensive periodical magazines from Europe. She was asking Collie to pay for them. But within these periodicals were the latest art movements, designs, interiors, whether it was from the Bauhaus, the Secessionist, whether it was Sonia Delaunay and Cubists and different movements like that. But
Mm,
Clarice, this businesswoman in the potteries, was creating things like this. Now, this is called Cafe because we believe it's based on that Sophie Tabauer Art Cafe. And it's incredibly rare. I mean, this is a rare piece of Clarice. The design is known on not many pieces. But if you just show you in the round how the pattern reads
look
as
at
you work around it, I mean, it's just so brilliant. And
this.
then the shape as well. And the fact is, this is about 1929 to 1930 and as rare as hen's teeth, but it shows you just how Clarice was aware of the wider world. And
Exactly.
I do a lecture called Inspiration and Influences,
Mm,
where basically I look at all of the different movements in the world and all the different artists. And you can make direct links to Modigliani, Mondrian, Sonia Delaunay, Sophie Tabauer Art. You can make direct relations to other movements in Europe, such as the secessionist movement, the Wiener Werkstatt. She knew far more than her competitors. And the other thing was that her designs marked a change in the potteries, where everybody else suddenly strived to fall in line behind her. But the one thing with Clarice was that she was too quick. If anybody copied her, she just cancelled the design and came up with a new one.
yeah.
And you get things like this. And I'll also show this, which again, one of my favorite designs. So this is a pattern called Tennis, and called Tennis because of that tennis net in the middle of the design. But this draws absolute direct relation and correlation to Robert and Sonia Delaunay in Paris in 1925 during the Exposition des Arts Décoratifs.
The whole 3D
So,
effect as well is just stunning.
oh,
Takes you into the
absolutely.
plate, doesn't it?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
if any of your members will of course, know the exhibition, get them to have a look at the motor car
Mm.
and the clothing that Sonia Delaunay created for the exhibition. And then 3 years later, you've got Clarice doing this. But then also, the things that most people know Clarice for are things like this.
Yeah.
Her whimsical landscapes, these wonderful, fun,
Oh,
stylized scenes, these bucolic fantasy scenes with trees. So
yeah.
whether it was geometric, whether it was landscapes or florals, she was phenomenal,
It was like surreal countryside, wasn't it? It was just so,
without a doubt. But every so often I will drive past things like thatched cottages,
yeah.
and you look at the line of the roof and you can see it. You look at fir trees and their shape and you see it. But the
Mm.
other thing with Clarice was she was so clever because she knew how to expand a range and a line. And, for example, Summer House, the vase I just showed you, well, the original one used to be banded in red. Well, coral red is the most expensive colour in the potteries. orange is the cheapest. And she realized that she could remove the red, paint it in orange. The buyers didn't care, but she'd saved a load of money.
Yeah.
If a pattern didn't sell, she just stopped it and made a new design.
Now,
So
for me,
everything
that is,
about her was,
yeah, no, sorry.
no, it's to say everything about her. She's constantly looking at the books and the bottom line and working of ways of how she can make things more effective and more cost effective and earn the company more money. And their kilns ran 364 days a year. The only day the kilns weren't firing was Christmas Day. So she was phenomenal.
Yeah, and that is true creativity, isn't it? Working with what you've got. That's where you create something different. And that was her flair, her gift. And like what you were saying earlier about Art Deco, the interconnecting from a dress to the house you're living in, that's exactly it. And she observed all of that.
Absolutely. And she also realized that she wanted to bring some color and some passion into really what was quite a dreary world. Collie Shorter, her boss to become her husband, was an incredible marketeer, unbelievable marketeer. And he knew that the value of Clarice and the girls was visibility. It's why her name was on the bottom of the wares. Collie embraced that. And the other thing that Collie did that was a genius in marketing was he used to take the Bizarre Girls and Clarice to the major department stores. And one of the first ones was at Waring and Gillows. And in Waring and Gillows, where before all they would have had in the pottery department would have been what they call a static display of wares. You go into a China retailer's now and into a department store, either be it Debenhams or Rackham's or House of Fraser or whatever, you will see pottery displays on shelves. That wasn't enough for Collie and for Clarice. They used to take the girls into the department stores and they would set up painting displays. And the girls would be sat there in artist smocks with great big bows and artist berets and palettes. And they would be painting the wares in front of the shoppers. And the shoppers just ate this up for breakfast.
Yeah.
Clarice only did the first couple because it became very clear that actually it didn't need to be Clarice. All it needed to be was that the workers were visible doing what they were doing.
Yeah.
And from there ended up a nationwide tour where, dare I say, and this is written, the most attractive girls were selected to go and be in the department store displays. But this is something else that was written in the days of the time. There was an article, I think it was the Stoke Sentinel, that said you could spot one of Miss Cliff's girls from 20 paces because they had the most bright clothes, the latest hairstyles, the most vibrant makeup. And you could spot a Miss Cliff Bizarre girl anywhere in Stoke-on-Trent. They knew that they were part of something different,
Yeah.
and they knew that they were changing the face of things. And they loved it. They loved it. They loved it. Was almost akin to stardom of its time
I mean,
because
it's like Hollywood, isn't it?
without a doubt. I
Yeah.
mean, they were getting to go. Most paintresses never got to leave Stoke-on-Trent. These girls were going to Leeds, to Liverpool, to London. Can you
Yeah.
imagine a young girl, 16, 17 years old? They were always chaperoned,
Yeah.
but they were being taken to the major department stores. And, you know, places like Lawley's. Lawley's were the biggest retailer of Clarice's wear.
Right.
And again, I'm going to quash an urban myth. Never sold in Woolworths. This stuff was expensive. It was far better than that. This was hand painted, very, very smart wares.
Right.
And you've got to bear in mind that in 1930, the conical Tifa 2 was the best selling wedding present of that year. So you are a young couple getting married, and we all know it. You did it, I did it. None of us ever want to do what our parents did. We always want to carve our own path. So you think if you're a young newlywed, you don't want chintz. Forget the chintz. You want to have your breakfast set. You want something like the conical, or, and I bought this to show you as well, why not go for the Stamford? I mean,
Oh,
this
right.
is absolutely groundbreaking of its time. And again, just look at the shape of this.
Yeah, the colours
And
are unusual too, aren't they?
yeah, this is a pattern called blue chintz.
Right.
Back in the day, we didn't know a lot of the pattern names, and we used to call this marshmallows. And then when we found the Bizarre Girls, we said, "Oh, what year did you introduce marshmallows?" And they went, "Marshmallows? It's not marshmallows, it's blue chintz." And this was Clarice's tongue-in-cheek take on chintz, not your tiny little flowers, great big blousy flowers, but also just look at that shape. Now, another little aside, Clarice got in real trouble with this teapot. This teapot, the Stamford, was launched in 1930 in London at one of the fixed hotel displays. And look how clever it is. See how the shape of that goes right round into the handle. Very smart design. Well, it was smart because Clarice had copied it.
Oh,
She
really?
had seen, yeah, she had seen this in one of her periodical magazines. Now, again, many of your members will know from the 1925 Paris exhibition, there is a very famous French silversmith called Tétard Frère, Maison Tétard Frère, fabulous French silversmiths. In 1925-26, they made this in solid silver. Clarice saw it and in 1930 launched her own version in ceramic. The silver one had a straight spout. The first few that Clarice issued were identical, but they didn't pour well, and the buyers complained. So Clarice took it back and remade the spout with a proper pouring lip. Now, this teapot was groundbreaking, but it was so groundbreaking and it sold so well, Maison Tétard Frère found out, saw it, knew that she had copied it without asking their permission, and they sent over a contingent from Paris to Stoke-on-Trent. And I can only imagine there were some fairly heated negotiations, and Collie Shorter had to make a fairly substantial payment to Maison Tétard Frère to allow permission for the shape to be continued. But
Really?
again, oh yeah, but again, put that to one side. This is Clarice saying, we're not having a normal teapot. We're going to have something that is Art Deco. We're going to have something that links to Paris, something that links to the greatest new movement changing the face, a movement that transformed the world after the Great War. But Clarice didn't care about rules. She didn't care about asking permission. She just wanted to make it possible for her lady buyers.
Yeah. So the original spout, because that was what struck me, so unusual as it was just literally straight up. It didn't have the
So,
lip.
correct. So the original spout literally went in a straight line, straight across. So it was cut off, which meant that when it poured, it flowed everywhere. And the buyers complained. So this is something for Clarice collectors now. Whenever we see a Stamford teapot, if you see one with a straight spout, you know it's early 1930,
Right.
because the rest of them were changed very, very quickly. Some of them were recalled. And she made this adaptation. But if you ever see a straight spout, you know you've got one of the early ones. The interesting thing was Wedgwood bought the rights to everything to do with Clarice, because Midwinter bought Clarice, Wedgwood bought Midwinter. And in the late 1990s, they relaunched a centenary edition. And at the time, the mold makers at Wedgwood actually said, this is impossible. We can't make this. So you're talking about a late 20th century factory with all the mechanization and abilities at their disposal. They couldn't believe that Clarice had made her yo-yo vase. And if anybody's listening, just go and look up Clarice Cliff yo-yo vase. They couldn't believe it had been made in one piece. And it took them months to work it out. And they did in the end. But what they basically said was, how on earth did Clarice make this in 1930? It was mind-boggling. And there is one quick story about her senior mold maker was a chap called Bill Lunt. Now, Bill was considered one of the best mold makers in the business. And he would often go head to head with Clarice and say, it can't be done. And she would say, yes, it can. You're Bill Lunt. Make it work. it will happen. And on one occasion, as she walked away, he was heard to say, "That bloody woman." Apparently, she stopped in her tracks, didn't turn round, just stopped, waited a moment, and carried on walking, just to let him know that she'd heard him.
Nice touch. Love it.
Nice touch, Clarice. Nice touch.
No, you reminded me when you said about Wedgwood buying up Clarice Cliff,
Yes.
because my son, he's only 14, and he really wanted to buy me a piece of Clarice Cliff for my birthday. Bless him. He went on eBay and realised no, it wasn't really in his
Yeah.
budget. But he did find me something. I'll just show you. Hang on. So he bought that.
Yeah, Bridgewater, one
Yeah,
of my
that's
favourite
it.
patterns.
Yeah.
Bridgewater. Yeah, absolutely.
And
Now,
I
this
thought,
was
where's that?
arranged,
Yeah.
yeah, and a fabulous design. Now, this
Yeah.
was arranged, and I would say probably in the late 90s, early noughties was when Clarice was absolutely flying globally. Part of that is because you've got to put it into context that people who were buying Clarice Cliff new probably would have been in their 20s when they were buying it new in the 1930s. So, by that token, by the 1990s, those 20-year-olds were becoming in their 80s and
Mm.
sadly passing away. So, over the course of the 90s, we had this deluge of pieces come to market as the first generation buyers sadly moved on and people were clearing homes and cupboards. So she was at an absolute, almost hype craze at that time. So much so that the hunger for her wares was immense. And some very shrewd people like Wedgwood got on board, and that was arranged done with the Bradford Exchange. And you know what? They're wonderful. If that were a genuine Bridgewater plate from 1933, that size, that beautifully painted, you'd be looking probably in the region of £500 for it, something
Really?
like that.
Yeah.
But if you haven't got that budget, and
Mm.
some people are very sniffy about the later copies, I'm not. They're licensed reproductions. And if your budget is limited, as your son's was, then what better way to have that burst of colour and that genius,
Mm.
you know, for a more affordable sum? I've got no problem with that. And it also means what you tend to find is people who start buying at £50 or £30, in time as their wallet allows, they become the £500 collectors.
Yeah.
I've never been snobby about it. My whole thing is get the designer out there, get her name known, get her work appreciated, however we make that happen.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I'm with you there. Definitely.
Which, well, it brings me on to one thing, which you may have headed this way to ask me anyway, but there are holy grail items in the world of Clarice Cliff, and I've bought these to show you. Now, these are for me the holy grail.
Oh, yes, of course. I love those. What are they called?
The Age of Jazz.
That's right.
So these are the Age of Jazz figures. Now, there's 5 in the set. I bought with you to camera just the pianist and guitarist, and I've also bought to show you the double dancers.
Oh, look, they're beautiful.
Now, these were designed by Clarice in around 1930. And this is exactly right. Now, they are flat, plain ceramic.
Mm.
So they are 3D cutouts. But again, showing Clarice's knowledge and understanding of a wider design market, these are, I believe, I found a source reference and was able to do the connection. In the 1920s, I think it's 1926 or 27, the front cover of Vanity Fair magazine featured a line drawing of a jazz party with dancers, and it is this. And Clarice took the idea and made these figures. And the idea for the Age of Jazz, and there were 5 of them. So there's the pianist and guitarist,
Yeah.
there's the drummers, the double dancers, then there's the jazz pair dancers, and then there's the quiet dancers. And their skirts were painted in a range of colours. Now, these are exactly the size. Sadly, like you, these are by Wedgwood. and
Yes.
these were done by Wedgwood
Yeah.
as, sorry, get that to camera, as edition copies. Now, that's partly because these are the first edition, so these are true to scale.
Mm.
They did a later version at half size. Now, I bought this set because for me, these are the Holy Grail. I mean, look at that. I mean, they're stunning.
They really are.
And the idea of these was, when she made them, that in her advertising, they were either meant to sit in front of the wireless to look like they were having a jazz party, or to dance down the center of your dinner table when you had guests.
Oh,
Now, they were incredibly expensive to make. They were a nightmare. They used to buckle in the kiln.
yeah.
They were very expensive. They didn't sell very well because they were so expensive to buy. And apparently, there was a whole stock of them sat on the shelves at Wilkinson's. So much so that one day, in a slight fit of pique, Collie Shorter grabbed them all the outstanding figures that hadn't been ordered or sold, and threw them onto the scrap pile on the site at Wilkinson's. Now, that's now a block of flats. So potentially underneath those flats are a group of Age of Jazz figures. They are my holy grail. So I am unlikely to ever be able to afford a full set of Age of Jazz.
Mm.
So I've bought the Wedgwood ones, and in my cabinet amongst my Clarice, they look fabulous. You can buy the Series 1 replicas for about £100 a figure, £80, £100 a figure. Well, £500, £400 to £500 for a replica set is a lot more affordable than the £70,000 to £85,000 you'd have to pay for the real deal.
Oh my goodness. That's
Yes,
incredible.
yeah. They probably still stand as the most expensive things that you could look to acquire as a collector.
Yeah.
I mean, the last double dancers that sold fetched, including buyer's premium, £18,000. So a full set plus the premium on a set, you're looking between 70 to £80,000. So I'm no prude. I'm not shy. I don't mind. I'll have my Wedgwoods. They're fine.
Got anything else tucked up your sleeve?
Landscapes are so iconically Clarice. And this is one of my all-time favourite designs, which is a pattern called House and Bridge, 1932. I mean, it's, again, anybody looking, and I always tend to find that Clarice can be, I sort of call it Marmite. It's Marmite. People either love her or hate her. But when I give my talks and I explain the genius of the woman, the business mind, the way that she was able to make a pattern stretch. If a pattern wasn't working, delete it, keep one step ahead of all her competitors, sell to global markets, have features in magazines everywhere, but also just put it into context of the time. We live in the 21st century. We are deluged, our senses are overloaded with pattern, form, color, shape, ideas, whether it's multimedia, digital, graphics, all of this, that you can, for a moment, put out of your mind the context of when this was new.
Mm.
We have to go back to, the late 20s, early 30s. And I appreciate I'm speaking to an audience who are very knowledgeable and know the era I'm talking about. And that's what I think people need to realize, is the fact that to have made a choice as a young woman to go into a shop and buy this when the generation before you was buying little tiny sprigs of flowers, and to make this statement and have, angular handles and diamonds and triangles and square dinner plates, well, rectangular dinner plates. That's what you have to do. You have to keep it in context of the time that she was working. And
Yeah.
I always think all of that put together, for me, I think she genuinely is. I think she is the most iconic ceramic designer of the 20th century.
What would be your dream piece of Clarice Cliff that you would personally like to own if you could choose one thing?
Probably a pattern, for some reason, that has always been incredibly elusive to me, is a design called May Avenue. it has eluded me. I've never owned a piece in nearly 40 years of collecting Clarice. And we were very fortunate. We had an 18-inch rigged charger through my auction house at Fieldings a number of years ago, which fetched the second highest price for a piece of Clarice at auction. And we got £24,000 for this plaque. And it's just the whole thing about the fact that it's Clarice wrapped up. It's a beautiful design. It has links to Modigliani. It's actually an interpretation of a painting he made called Landscape at Cannes. It also ties to May Avenue in the Potteries, because she used to drive to work every day past a road called May Avenue. And this is something Clarice did. There are many patterns that she assigned a name to that are relevant to her life. I mean, I'm very, very fortunate to own. A few years ago, I probably did manage to acquire the Holy Grail, which is, there was an auction came up in not very far from me, and in it was a folder of documents relating to Wilkinson's and Clarice Cliff, and the estimate was £50 to £80, and it was during COVID, when you couldn't go and you couldn't view, but you could still bid online. And I asked for photographs, and I spotted what was in there, and somebody else spotted what was in there as well. But I bid for it, and I bid for it, and I kept going, and I was determined I wasn't going to let it go. And I went to collect it a couple of weeks later on a click and collect, you know, masked up, all that. Got in the car, my hands literally shaking. And I opened the folder in the car to look down to check it was there. And I now own Clarice Cliff's 1927 contract of employment. And yeah, and it was signed by her and Collie Shorter. And the thing that I love about it is that the document is written out in longhand by Collie Shorter. And it said that we hereby, it's at the launch of Bazaar, it's June 1927, at the launch of Bazaar. And it says, I, Collie Shorter, do hereby agree to extend the term of your contract for another 3 years, signed Collie Shorter. And underneath that is repeated, I hereby agree to the extension of my term for another 3 years, Clarice Cliff. Do you know the thing I love, though?
Go on.
The 3 years has been crossed out, and above it is the word 5.
Oh,
And that's Clarice. That is Clarice going,
incredible.
3 years?
Yeah.
You're having a laugh. I'm staying for 5. And I actually managed to give that to the company to the writer who was writing the screenplay,
Yeah.
and they changed the end of the film because of that document. Nobody knew it existed. We thought it had been lost. And I suppose for all the pots, everything, the fact is that I have her original contract of employment between her and Collie. The only other thing I would like to really own is her 1922 indenture. And I know where it is, and I know who's got it. Maybe one day I'll be able to reunite the two. But all I'll say is her contract is now safe, and it will end up in a museum collection when I'm gone.
Will Farmer, thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's been a joy sharing your passion for all things Clarice Cliff. Very good evening.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.